Hi, this is Paul. It's time to dive into just how far our conversations are from the civil war going on in mainline evangelicalism. Not the mainline, but the dominant evangelicalism. As I mentioned on the live stream this morning, I've been enraptured by this conversation between Chris Pacow and Emily Verdine. Now, some of you might remember Emily was on my channel in April 2019, and I thought it was a tremendous conversation that we had then. And she's been in and out of the comments section. We haven't really kept track. She's visited some of the meetups in Grand Rapids, and the conversation I thought she had with Chris was really quite something. And I had a little back and forth with Chris about psychedelics in the question and answer today. So if you missed some of that, it's in the YouTube because I didn't record it. And re-downloading a live stream from YouTube is a little trickier. It takes a little bit of time for YouTube to sort of totally reprocess the live stream. But I should have that up on the audio-only podcast sometime soon. All of this in the same day that, okay, Hank Cruz, I know you're about to have a stroke. You're an old man when I pull this one up. Bill Harris, a friend of mine who I've mentioned before, he's on CRC Voices. He sent me this on Apple Podcasts. And of course, I did a little digging because I knew that Skye Jitani and Phil Visser do. And Skye and Phil are about as close to the center of evangelicalism as it gets. Phil Visser, who's the creator of VeggieTales, Skye Jitani, a former editor of Christianity Today, now sort of being a celebrity evangelical with his podcast and with his writing and all those kinds of things, had a conversation with Josh Packard. And I didn't know anything about Josh Packard. Josh Packard is part of an organization. I just posted it on my blog. If you want to know where my filing cabinet is, you can find it at leadingchurch.com. Josh Packard runs an organization called Springtide Research Institute. Now, back in at the end of the seeker movement, there was Barna. Ryan Berg, you'll find me citing him sometimes in terms of research. Pew obviously does a lot of religious research, but Josh Packard seems to be doing some research about deconstruction, sort of from the progressive evangelical space. And they just put out a digital report that you can download for free if you sacrifice up your email address. And this is always sort of the way these things flow. I haven't had a chance to read this yet. This sort of comes out of the moderately affluent white evangelical, sort of politically moderate, maybe a little left-leaning anxiety over the fact that their churches are dying and their kids aren't coming to the faith. And so they will tend to fund these kinds of surveys that will have lots of statistics about what they do and don't believe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what's been happening, I should back up and talk about what's been happening in the evangelical world. Short summary of history. If you want to read a lot more of it, read George Marsden's Fundamentalism and American Culture. That will bring you up to Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason. Those are two excellent books to sort of give you a sense of the landscape. And that will bring you into the neo-evangelicals. That was very much led by Billy Graham, Christianity Today, Wheaton College, Fuller Theological Seminary. These are sort of the main institutional bodies of evangelicalism in the mid to late 20th century. Part of what happens is that all of that comes together in the seeker movement in many ways. And the seeker movement, the heart of the seeker movement was wisdom. And some of the hallmarks of the seeker movement were Bill Hybels, Rick Warren. And the way the seeker movement worked was that they they had a seeker service, which was sort of primetime Sunday morning. Initially, especially Willow Creek had their believer service, which was something like Wednesday night. And in the seeker service, the preacher would preach, they would have contemporary music, something to really stir the people and get the people involved. And then they would have sermons mostly based on wisdom literature in the Bible. And the idea was to present a better way of life that would afford credibility to the institution as these people will give you a better way to live. And there were classes to teach people how to manage money better. There were seminars for people's marriages. There were parenting seminars. It was very boomer oriented. It was very expert driven. But the whole point was we as an institution afford wisdom to the people in order in some ways to live their best life now and to have heaven to boot. So in that way, it wasn't disconnected from, let's say, prosperity gospel megachurches, but they distinguished themselves from it. They had a little bit more of an orthodox understanding of the role of suffering, et cetera, et cetera. Just as an aside with Chris Pakow, and I thought some of the really profound things he was saying about suffering, that's very unlike, and I know Chris goes to Joel Osteen's church in Houston, that's very unlike his preacher. I think Chris Pakow knows more about suffering and has better wisdom about suffering than Joel Osteen, just listening to Chris. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't listened to a lot of Joel Osteen sermons. So just a conversation in there. But when I look at Chris and Emily talking in this video, I hear much more of a cutting edge of what I see coming down the road than what I find in this Springtide group and all of their surveys. To one degree or another, by the time you get a survey, your survey isn't really looking at the trend leaders. They're looking at the mass of the sheep. And what I tend to think we are looking at in our little conversations tend to be the edge of the wave rather than the center of the swell, which is what I think these researchers are researching. And that's why, Peterson is right that the church is going to have to contend with the psychedelic questions. And again, I talked about that quite a bit in the question and answer, and I'm sure we're not done talking about it. Because what happens in these conversations, and I know this frustrates a lot of people, especially if you're sort of a Myers-Briggs J, you come to your decision and you sit on your decision. The Myers-Briggs Ps can talk about it for a long, long time. And especially when, as a culture, we're sort of working out and sussing through things, well, we'll be talking about these things for a while. Now, back to the story of evangelicalism. So the seeker movement really had its heyday, the 1980s, the 1990s, and then was sort of petering out in the early 2000s. At the end of the 90s, you had what was called the emergent movement. And the emergent movement included people as diverse and different as Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber. Why? Well, Nadia Bolz-Weber, as I mentioned before, are sort of like opposites in the emergent movement, and all were sort of reacting to the boomer culture, the expertise, the button it down, the control it, the production value of the seeker movement. And they wanted something much more raw, something much more authentic, something much more gritty, much more grime lines rather than sort of smooth narratives. But the emergent movement fractured, and it fractured into the progressive evangelicals, many of whom, like Nadia Bolz-Weber, have simply gone all the way over into the main line. Rachel Held Evans was certainly heading that way before she died. Nadia Bolz-Weber is now a landmark. She's now a segment of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America wants to make or the LCA, Lutheran Church of America, wants to make her the face of the church, Nadia Bolz-Weber, and, tattooed, former stand-up comedian, all of this stuff. And again, I've had a video before talking about the relationship between her and Mark Driscoll. And again, for many of you, it sounds like Mark Driscoll and Nadia Bolz-Weber should be two diametrically opposite people, but they're really not. They hold so much in common, even though they split and are opposing on many of these so-called culture war issues. Of course, Nadia Bolz-Weber talks about ethically sourced porn, premarital sex, if it's authentic to you, LGBT, all of the progressive issues, and of course, Mark Driscoll against. But those weren't the only two branches of the fracturing of the evangelical church as seen in the emergent movement. You've also got two other factions. Well, how to categorize Driscoll right now? He's sort of in exile. Other elements of it, I think, are, well, the Young, Restless, and Reformed was very much where Driscoll started, and he sort of emerged from there. But you've also got the neo-sacramentalist, which I think many of you are sort of emerging into, and I think that will probably become a movement. It had its roots in sort of the ancient modern stuff, but I think we're going to see a coalition probably among the traditional sacramentalist denominations like Orthodox and Roman Catholic, and now Anglicans and more Protestants coming in terms of the neo-sacramentalists. That's still unformed yet, and it's really where a lot of the Christian audience of this channel is sort of camping. And those are basically the fractures of it. Another piece of this story is Rob Bell, and this article really deserves its own video. It's in Los Angeles Magazine. Rob Bell, in some ways, is sort of the epitome of the spiritual progressive evangelical. And he's sort of a lost boy right now. An evangelical icon finds salvation in West Hollywood. Yeah. And the article is well written. It's written by a guy who's obviously sort of working through some pro-felicity, processing his own story in terms of where Rob Bell's story has emerged. And Rob Bell would very much be sort of at the edge of the neo-evangelicals, or at the edge of the progressive evangelicals, and someone who, of course, was sort of at the center of it, went to Wheaton College, founded Mars Hill in Grand Rapids, was having productive conversations early on with leaders at Calvin, my alma mater, both seminary and college, now university, like Richard Mao, encouraged by them. But he's just sort of living his best life in LA, more or less detached from the church, sort of out there floating, in the words of these people, the spring, what are they calling themselves? Springtide research, unbundled. If there's someone that's unbundled, it's Rob Bell. And just the pictures of him from this article. Here he is riding his bike with no hands. Here he is out for a coffee on the boardwalk near Venice Beach. Here he is sort of in a meditative position with his dog. And these pictures do sort of set the tone for this article. Now, part of what's going on in this section, which was really lit up recently, there's a fight going on right now on Twitter between David French, who is PCA, and Kevin DeYoung, who is a celebrity pastor in the PCA church. You might notice Kevin DeYoung has a Dutch last name. If you've got a Dutch last name, you notice all the other Dutch last names. And Kevin DeYoung was, for a while, a pastor in the Reformed Church of America, got fed up with the Reformed Church of America and their trying to straddle the LGBTQ issues. The Reformed Church of America couldn't figure out a way to discipline the East Coast churches and classes that were going full-blown affirming, even as the denomination was growing with respect to ethnic minorities who were conservative and young, restless, and reform types in the West. And that denomination is basically fracturing at the moment. And colleagues of mine are now participating in a new split-off group, the Alliance of Reformed Churches. And so, of course, those of us in the Christian Reformed Church are looking over there saying, what? Because just 5-10 years ago, all the talk was, the Christian Reformed Church and Reformed Church of America should merge. And now the Reformed Church of America can't even hold itself together. So Kevin DeYoung left the Reformed Church of America and went over into the Presbyterian, the PCA, the PCUSA. I know this is hard to keep track of for those of you unfamiliar with church. The Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, PCUSA, is sort of the large mainline church that is in numeric freefall and has been for a long time. They've, as a denomination, they've struck many of the progressive stances, and they're being rewarded for it by huge numbers of defection to the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of America, defections to other little splinter groups, and the PCA, Presbyterian Church of America, which is Tim Keller's denomination, has for a long time been a conservative Presbyterian alternative to the old mainline. The PCA does not ordain women as elders or pastors, and they're fairly conservative. But now the fight is going on even within the PCA. David French has sort of become how to describe David French right now in the role that he's playing. I know a bunch of you will have words for it. I don't get particularly incensed by David French, but I know a lot of you do. And so he's sort of been not sufficiently anti-woke to not be considered woke by certain groups of people. So I haven't read enough David French to really categorize him. You're going to form your own opinions. But he's been reliably writing posts like this post, Deconstructing White Evangelical Politics. He's part of the Never Trumpers who really felt betrayed that Republicans went over to Trump and have many of whom have stayed there. And this posting is, for the most part, an analysis that says that American evangelicals that have embraced Trump have abandoned their theology for politics. And Kevin DeYoung on Twitter basically took him on, and so now they're having a fight. And if you want someone in our little corner of the internet who loves to follow these fights and will certainly share her opinions with you, you can find Esther O'Reilly Bethel McGrew. She will certainly share her opinions on these things. But this fight here is important for someone like me to sort of track, because the fissures are emerging. What do we mean by anti-racism? Where, in fact, are the lines? Can you overlook Trump's less than puritanical approach to living, either sexually or with respect to money, and flaunting it for the sake of Supreme Court justices and the platform that he tended to strike, or as someone who's just going to go out there and own the libs for however you stand with respect to Trump? And so David French and Kevin DeYoung are currently going at it on Twitter. So when my friend sends me, I didn't want to close that. So the video I posted Friday morning, just a little short 20-minute job, where I pulled up the article about evangelical Muslims. We're getting into this question. David French sort of wants to, and many others do, sort of wants to imagine this firewall between one's theology and politics. that's really going to be hard to hold. And this article on the born again Muslims and Muslim evangelicals is a terrific example that these things are pretty darn porous. And when it comes to Gen Z and what's going on with them, well, it's all over the place. So I have to admit that when I watch something like Phil Vischer and Skye Jitani, I know some of you get hives because of you're deep in this civil war. I don't feel myself in this civil war. To me, this civil war feels way back on the wave. And when I listen to Chris and Emily talk, I say, no, this is where the wave is at. These kids back here who are deconstructing, they're going to be over here by Chris Pacow and Emily Verdine in not too long a time. I might be wrong. To me, that's what it looks. And so I don't tend to pay too much attention to these establishment evangelical experts anymore, because I simply don't think their analysis goes far enough. I think they're seated way too far within the buffers of evangelicalism, and not much is going to, I don't expect a lot of light from them. Now, what I found interesting in this conversation is when these two get into what they call the values gap.
Okay, let's talk about the values gap, because this is probably
Sure.
one of the more interesting parts of your report. Essentially, you asked young people, Gen Z, what are issues they care about, and you kind of rank them, and we'll get into what some of these issues are, and then you asked them whether their perception was that religious communities cared about. How much did they care about these issues? And there's a gap between how much they care and what they perceive religious communities care. Why is this data important or valuable?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question to be asking. I mean, so we got, if the right way to understand how young people are engaging with faith is increasingly through this unbundled lens, well, we wanted to know why. Like, why unbundle all of these things, or why take them in piece by piece instead of.
Okay, now when he's talking about unbundled, he's basically saying that, surprise, surprise, the children of the boomers don't find much authority in religious institutions. Shocked. I'm just shocked. Of course, their parents did this back in the 60s, and then the people my age, I mean, we're probably, when the Gen Z, half my kids are millennials and half my kids are Gen Z. So my kids are sort of right on the cusp of them. And I'm right on I was born right on sort of the boundary waters between the Gen Xers and the boomers. So I don't really feel like I'm in either. And so what he was talking about earlier in this conversation is that, well, basically all the kids are sort of buffet spirituality. They're picking and choosing, and they can find it from the internet. And so that's the unbundling that he's talking about. But what we find are a variety of other bundles. And I think part of the spat between David French and Kevin DeYoung is basically the bundles, in that people are looking at these bundles of values in pretty low resolution ways and saying more over here and less over here. And a lot of it even has more to do necessarily with style and some deeper archetypes than necessarily positions.
They're just, engaging with an entire system. And part of that answer came back to these really key social issues that are surrounding a set of values that young people hold to be paramount in their lives.
Okay, there's a hierarchy word. These values are paramount in their lives.
And then there's just a real disconnect that they see along these things. Now, part of what
so they have a hierarchy, and there are certain values and actually certain positions that are paramount in their lives, what they really care about, and the church doesn't seem to be talking about what they really care about.
What's really weird about this is that while young people will say things like, I don't trust youth ministers, but I like my youth minister. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like last year, when we looked at just the affiliated young people, so young people checking the box as Christian or Buddhist or whatever, like half of young people who are affiliated say that they don't trust organized religion. So this is really interesting, right? I mean, it's that this really is something that occurs at the micro level. Now, what that means is that generally speaking, lots and lots and lots of young people, even those who are religious, do not see other religious people as part of their in-group. And sociologically, what happens is that when we talk about who's not in our in-group, the people in our out-group, we're quicker to paint with a broad brush, we're less forgiving of mistakes. And this is where stereotypes come in, and we're sort of operating on some pretty broadly held assumptions.
And so when you get to, let's say, even David French and Kevin DeYoung, both of whom are in the Presbyterian Church of America, which, in terms of a slice of the spectrum on American positions, PCA is pretty narrow. And so they're even cutting down the PCA, which means that anybody looking at it would say, oh, there are a lot of cross pressures that we are getting very sensitive about, that we are distinguishing from ourselves. So if a fellow member of the PCA is my out group, whether that be Kevin DeYoung looking over at David French or David French looking over at Kevin DeYoung, you know that there is a good amount of fracturing happening, and there's a huge amount of reorganization underway.
So I think it's largely what we've got here is that after now a long time of institutional mistrust and disconnection, we've got religious communities largely serving as an out group for young people. And so when we ask young people, how much do you care about these issues? They tell us, 71% say they care a lot about LGBTQ plus rights. 77% say they care a lot about gender equity and immigration rights and income inequality. But they think that...
Okay, pause there. What do they care about? They care about all the stuff that's been fed to them. That's their real religion. That's what they care about. That's what's at the top of their hierarchy. And they look at church and they say, I want my church to be all about these things. Here's an article that when I searched for this guy's name and his organization, this one came up pretty quickly. Now, it's from Deseret News. Now, some of you out east might have no idea what Deseret means and what that little beehive means, but if you've ever visited Salt Lake City and had much contact with the Mormons, this is, if Grand Rapids, Michigan is the center of the world for the Christian Reformed Church and Western Michigan is the center of the world for Dutch Calvinists in America, Salt Lake City is the center of the world for the Mormons. Very much so. And so here's this, nice looking young woman sort of here. You got pumpkins on the porch. And I mean, Salt Lake City's a cool city. I was just there for a little bit of work. And, Salt Lake City's one of those cities I look like, oh, I wouldn't mind living in Salt Lake City. It looks pretty cool. America's youth are religious. They're spiritual, but they don't trust institutions. You don't say. Wearing bright orange shirts and standing on a strip facing the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., the small group of young protesters held signs that read, "Love God, love your neighbor, act on climate." This wasn't just a Saturday afternoon demonstration. It was also a demonstration of faith, as placards suggest. These young people were part of YECA, or Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Their speech was filled with quotes from the Bible, Ecclesiastes to be specific. Ecclesiastes. That's the that would be the book I would guess first. But again, wisdom. Said the field organizer Jenna Vendonselaar. That's a very Dutch name. The ethos of our work on climate action comes out of our calling as Christians, she said, explaining that the Bible compels the faithful to take care of the environment. She's right, I think it does. But she added that she doesn't see many churches heeding that command. No, churches should be about climate change. Oh. I don't know how we're reading the same gospel. This is exactly what David French is talking about. This is exactly where the fighting line between Kevin DeYoung and David French is happening. Because there's something at the top of the hierarchy and everything else is getting filtered down below. And this is natural when it comes to human beings. She said of the conservative-leaning congregations that ignore climate change and other progressive issues, my faith is rooted in a call to social justice and a call to social action. So where is this coming from? She didn't get this from church, which is kind of what she's complaining about, that in terms of her salience, landscape, and hierarchy, these things are at the top. It's that simple. And that these two are sort of talking about it as, well, he a little before he was saying, yeah, well, churches used to do is we'd have pizza and maybe paintball, or we'd have pizza and maybe a haunted house, scream in the dark. We'd bring the kids in for fun, amusement, and then we'd hit them with a gospel message, and then some of them would come forward, and there we would be. But this isn't working. So, well, what should we do now? Well, what we see most colleges and many denominations, and if we want to retain the kids, we've got to make our church all about LGBTQ and climate change and everything else. The problem is that they're going to get that better off out on the internet in groups that are further along the field and further up the wave. And, Republicans are sort of have, to some degree done similar things with respect to their churches, which is why we have this polarization in the church to begin with, at least along political lines. Churches have long had reasons to fight about things.
And even when they describe themselves as religious, they still say, "Oh, but I don't think religious communities care about those things." So that they only think 44% of religious communities care about LGBTQ plus rights, only 52. So there's a 20-point gap on all of these issues. The ones I've mentioned, plus disability rights, environmental causes, reproductive rights, racial justice, gun reform, etc. It's fascinating. I don't think I think, like a lot of the work we do at Springtide, it can be really easy to get carried away with one data point, but the real story is in the combination of them.
Yes.
And that's the thing that matters here. It's not that.
So he's used the word unbundling, but really this is a bundling. It's a bundling of political issues that the church has become a proxy to go out and do your business. And I think part of this is because, churches have long been seen, and I've seen this in my own denomination. Well, we want to somehow get up into the denominational bureaucracy to use the denomination to promote these specific issues that we find to be the cutting edge of the expression of our faith. That's exactly what we see happening. But that's, I think, why a lot of people look at David French right now and just say, you're complaining about these lines? Both sides have these lines. If you're going to make the church proxies in these larger political culture war things, and why have a church at all? You already have political parties. You already have action groups. And it's been an extremely evangelical thing to do, to basically take what is sort of a movement in the culture that doesn't seem terrifically connected to anything that's going on in church, and just sort of me to it by saying, oh, youth for climate action, Christian youth for climate action for Jesus. There's nothing more quintessentially evangelical than that.
there's a 15% difference in gun reform. It's that there's a consistent gap on all of these issues.
Right. Okay. So that's what I wanted to talk about, because there's so much here that I found interesting. First of all, I got to call some BS on some of this stuff, because not again on your data. I think you're reporting accurately what the young people are reporting. It's what they're saying about themselves that I'm going, come on.
Okay, sure.
You're telling 80% of teenagers, essentially, 80% say they care deeply about disability rights. What are
In theory, unless it inconveniences them,
they doing that indicates they care about disability rights, other than for me it feels like a little bit of a halo effect, right, where you're asking them, do you care about gay rights, gender equality, immigration, income inequality, and they're looking at this list and they're going, yeah, I care about all those things, and they're saying, yes, I care, because they want to feel like they care.
Not only they want to feel like they care, but they understand completely how social hierarchies work. They might not know the word hierarchy, they might not put all of this stuff together, but they understand what's going to give them status and what's going to lose them status. And of course, you can flip this around and do it the other way in a different part of the country, and it works the same way. Now, if you want to see another space where this whole thing is being battled out, well, Neil Shenvy, he's been on the channel too. I'm probably the only channel that's had, no, except for Unbelievable. It just shows you. Justin Brierley has also had both Neil Shenvy and KK DeMay, the author of Jesus and John Wayne. I've had both of them on my channel, and I'm happy too. But he's having a little bit of a friendly response with Mike Bird. Now, Mike Bird is an evangelical scholar from Australia, and they've gone back and forth. And to a degree, partly because, well, Shenvy is Shenvy, and he's not a theologian, but what he's been doing on his blog is sort of, writing down what he finds in all these critical theory books, and that really annoys some people. But then he wrote an article for this was Michael. Let me find the article. Okay. He wrote an article for the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Some people are going to be really triggered. They can't see cbmw.org and get triggered. But this article that he wrote, I thought was really very good. And again, he's sort of, pointing out that this David French, Kevin DeYoung thing, I think what's annoying people about David French is acting, I can't stand it when people are culture warriors and they're saying, you're fighting in it. In the past few years, numerous Christian scholars have produced books garnering national attention. Kristen Kobes-Dumay was interviewed on NPR about her book Jesus and John Wayne. Beth Allison Barr, author of Making of Biblical Womanhood. Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry's Taking Back America for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, yada, yada, yada. These books have numerous common features. All of them were written by professing Christian scholars with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. All of them address hot-button issues in contemporary cultures, and all of them reach conclusions that resonate with left-of-center perspectives. Okay, people are really sensitive. I mean, the culture is sort of inflamed along predictable lines. However, for the purposes of this article, I'll expand on one other commonality they all share in a dangerous approach to theology via the discipline of sociology and history. Now, you can go back and you can watch my conversations with Kristen Dumay and with Neil Shenvy. Neil Shenvy is not a theologian. The best way Neil Shenvy is a scientist. He's a theoretical chemist. And he's a homeschooler. And the best way I can describe Neil Shenvy is that he's a code checker. What do I mean by that? He sort of approaches theology as code. And what he's done with his blog is he's looked at this code and he's sort of looked at canonical evangelical code, and he tries to match them up, and he says, these things aren't matching. That's kind of what his blog does. Now, some people say he's not being fair, but again, he's a code checker. He's just sort of putting words up side by side and saying, do these things match? They don't look like they match to me. The books listed above have a similar rhetorical structure. Step 1. The author identifies a problem either in history or contemporary politics. The problem involves power dynamics. Okay, so again, David French was all about, you've got your theology and you've got your politics. Well, all of these books are basically saying, ooh, there's not a firewall between theology and politics here. Saying one expresses the other, which I think is true. The author identifies a problem either in history or contemporary politics. The problem involves power dynamics of one kind or another, white supremacy, patriarchy, nationalism, etc. In most cases, the historical events described by the authors are indeed horrific and call attention to our nation's lamentable failure to live up to biblical standards of justice. Now remember, Shenvy's a code checker. This is what he does. And he doesn't major in nuance. He majors in code. He's a scientist. In contemporary times, sexual abuse scandals, patriotic celebrations in the middle of worship services, and cringeworthy displays of so-called biblical masculinity should give us pause. And in a polarized, it's sort of like gang warfare or the mob. If you don't sort of go overboard to demonstrate your bona fides, your bona fides, then you're the enemy. So you think it's okay if you nibble on that hot dog and you're a Muslim and you say, well, I thought it was a chicken frank and not a pork frank. The situation from a college friend of mine who I had friends across the hall at Calvin. One was Muslim, one was Hindu, one was from Pakistan, the other from India. And the grandmother of one told her grandson, don't close your eyes, he'll stab you in the back. So step 1, identify a problem, either in history or contemporary politics. And, well, the problem involves power dynamics of one kind or another, which is, nothing that you might have heard of before 10 years ago. The author argues that Christians either actively endorse or were complicit in these widespread acts of injustice. Again, many of the accusations are true. And now these standards, you mean you're standing around and allowing China to do all the horrible things that China does? How can you call yourself a Christian and allow the regime of North Korea to continue to do what they're doing to their people right now? Well, I guess I should. I guess every Sunday in my church should be about what? Suffering Christians in North Korea? The treatment of the Uyghurs in China? Part of the difficulty that we have is combinatorial explosiveness of evil in the world. At any given moment, there are many, many issues of power dynamics and evil in the world that we are complicit with. Do you own things? Do you own an iPhone? Aha! Destroyer of the universe. Killer of oppressed people in China. Foxconn is the devil. The author argues that Christians either actively endorsed or were complicit in widespread acts of injustice. Again, many of these accusations are true. This is Shenvy talking. He says, yeah, they're right. Entire denominations split over the issues of slavery. At a time when church attendance was far more widespread than today, the government was engaged in forced displacement of Native Americans, and white professing Christians were engaged in acts of racial terrorism, lynching. Step 3. The author concludes that Christian lament and even explicit public repudiation of past injustices are not enough. Hundreds of years of participation in white supremacy, patriarchy, and nationalism have warped white evangelical theology such that it needs to be fundamentally reimagined. Okay. How? Well, that's what people are writing about. Well, this is how we can fundamentally imagine it without, are you really going to somehow divorce yourself from that legacy? Do you somehow have a moral clean room that you can do this in and not have any of the implicit patriarchy or the blood of Canaanites on your hands if you're using the Bible at all? These are the kind of things that are sort of working underneath. To many evangelicals, especially among the younger generation, this argument strikes a chord. What are we to make of it? And he goes through some examples. A hallmark of the books discussed above is that they are unmistakably prescriptive. In generations past, modernist value-neutral approaches to history and sociology aim to merely describe objective facts about the past or the present. And of course, anybody who's familiar with what we talk about in this channel all the time, this is a deeply modern approach. Well, we can sort of have a monarchical vision from above. We can sort of take out the personhood at all within it and just see it as it is. This is value neutral. This is the scientific perspective on history. The influence of critical social theories, however, has motivated contemporary scholars not only to recognize their own biases, but to embrace an intentional, activist, value-laden stance towards their subject matter. Okay, we're going to bring the person back into it, and now we're going to bring the person in order to offset the latent white supremacy, heteronormity, all of these things, and we're going to lean it the other way and therefore somehow correct it. As a result, books like The Making of Biblical Womanhood or White Too Long or The Color of Compromise are not merely intended to teach us about the past, but to shape our attitudes, actions, and belief in the present. This is, in a sense, we're postmodern now. Moral value neutrality is impossible, so in order to correct the value, we have to lean a certain way, and that way will make sure we don't redo the past. We might pause and ask ourselves, wasn't the leaning of the past probably in response to other leaning in even previous generations? And in fact, what we all always tend to do is overreach and lean one way and lean the other way. The authors of these books move from the descriptive is to the normative ought in two ways. First, the use of broad categories enables the authors to compress a wide spectrum of beliefs and practices into a narrow good-bad binary using moral-loaded language. Anybody who uses an automobile is killing the world. Walk. Once again, we accept the idea that male headship, no matter how qualified or nuanced, is a form of Christian patriarchy. It will be increasingly difficult to defend. The battle is not being waged at the level of exegesis, but at a level of terminology. Similarly, if Christian nationalism encompasses opposition to abortion and a defense of traditional marriage, then the debate, at least at the rhetorical level, is over. Few people want to be a Christian nationalist. Evangelicals may not even realize the game being played until it's too late, when they find themselves forced to defend white supremacy or Christian nationalism or the patriarchy, not because they support any of those things, but because the terms have all been redefined. And again, those of you spending a few years in James Lindsay, Jordan Peterson, this is all not new. One is reminded of Alice's admonition. The question is whether you can make words mean so many different things. And Humpty Dumpty's prescient rejoinder, the question is, which is to master? Which is to be master? That's all. These words are weapons. The one who controls the language controls the debate. Second, all the books in the genre look underneath traditional evangelical justifications for complementarianism or sexual ethics or pro-life positions to expose the real reasons for these positions. Power, the most powerful bulverism we have. What evangelicals have claimed to be clear biblical teaching on these issues is merely a way for them to justify their white male Christian privilege, which is, of course, if someone is playing this game, then you listen to Glenn Lowry about African Americans, or you find Rosaria Butterfield about gays. And I mean, it's just the identity game is just so darn simple. It's easy to play. And if there's profit in playing the culture war game on one side, there's plenty of profit found playing the culture war game on the other side. Money is in some ways a very old bulverism as well. Evangelicalism is not simply a religious group at all. Rather, it is a nationalistic political movement whose purpose is to support the hegemony of white Christian men over and against the flourishing of others. Complementarianism is patriarchy, and patriarchy is about power. Neither have ever been about Jesus. And see, that's part of the reason groups are responding to David French, is because they listen to David French and they say, well, you're playing the same game. The battle over inerrancy is in part a proxy fight over gender. Inerrancy matters because of its connection to the culture and political issues, like abortion and same-sex marriage. It was their efforts to bolster patriarchal authority that Southern Baptists united with evangelicals across the nation. Patriarchy was at the heart of the new sense of themselves. The critic is permitted to continually see through evangelical reasoning, arguments, and exegesis to reveal them as mere tools for projecting white power. Then disagreement is impossible. Indeed, disagreement is merely further evidence of the evangelicals' commitment to the white supremacist patriarchy, if they are a white male, or their internalized oppression, if they are not. And of course, this game is so easy, you can just flip it around and play it the other way, such as Black Lives Matter. The fact that, someone who's running Black Lives Matter buys an expensive house in Southern California. Aha! She's just in it for the money. And you don't really care about black lives because the majority of black lives are lost not at the hands of white police officers, but at the hands of violence in their own neighborhood. And not a word gets said about that. So did their black life matter? On and on and on. You can play these games. To throw one more crazy term into this, we have the pro-felicity, which is increasingly we are conscious of how we are seen in our mirrors. If you go to YouTube and you search for mirror self-recognition test animals, they test all of these animals to see, well, what animals can sort of identify. They'll anesthetize the animal. They might put a little piece of tape or paint on them. And when they look in a mirror, instead of attacking the mirror or thinking that the mirror is another animal, they recognize the piece of tape or the paint on them, and that then tells people who are doing this research, oh, they have a sense of how they are seen. Well, what are we doing? How are we seen? How are we seen by the world? Surely we want to be seen, well, as high status creatures. If we're moral, we'll be trusted. If we're moral, we'll have access. If we're popular, well, we'll be able to go further. This is what the game always is. And when you've got children, well, they're just learning. They're just coming into the game, and they're learning the game fast. And in many ways, social media is sort of the testing ground, sort of the battlefield by which they arise through the ranks and find themselves at the top of their own hierarchies. The game is pervasive, but it's simplistic. And many of us have seen it as simplistic. And if you're going to try to save your church for Gen Z by, making your church flying flags of certain color outside your church, or maybe deciding you're going to have paintball for Jesus, sorry, Grizz, or a gun club, or whatever side of get everyone all interested in fighting abortion. Well, that will feel meaningful. I tend to think that what the conversations that we're finding in this little corner of the internet are doing are people who, well, they've kind of run through that system and realized, I can fight about politics left and right, and how much does that matter? And in some ways, Skye Jitani's exasperation that, what do these kids know about any of this? They're kids. And once they get a little bit older and they've tried a few things, including some drugs, including some sex, including a lot of video games, including on and on and on and on and on, they're going to start to form opinions. And part of what I think we probably should be doing is, in fact, doing exactly what we are doing, in that, well, let's give them some space and some time to start talking these things through. I look at the Shenvy article, and of course you're going to deconstruct kids. If the adults sort of if the adults sort of cave, I mean, is the problem really with the kids that they're confused and don't know enough? No, that's what it means to be young. The problem is with the adults, that they somehow abdicate authority and responsibility. Okay, now, a long time ago, we figured out that this brings up an article that maybe I can pull up. Dead links are the bane of my archiving existence. I found it again ago. Will Willimon. Though I could not have known it at the time, a momentous event in my faith journey occurred on Sunday evening in 1963 in Greenville, South Carolina, when, in defiance of the state's archaic blue laws, the Fox Theater opened on Sunday. 7 of us, regular attenders of the Methodist Youth Fellowship at Buncombe Street Church, made a pact to enter the front door of the church, be seen, then quietly slip out the back door and join none other than John Wayne at the Fox. Now, I'm sure many of you don't know who Will Willimon is. No one will accuse Will Willimon on being on the wrong side of the culture war, unless maybe you're conservative. Only lately have I come to see how that evening symbolizes a watershed in the history of Christianity in the United States. I can make this bigger. On that night, Greenville, South Carolina, the last pocket of resistance to secularity in the Western world, gave in and served notice that it would no longer be a prop for the church. If Christians were going to make it in Greenville, the church must do it alone. There would be no more free passes for the church, no more free rides. The Fox Theater went head-to-head with the church to see who would provide ultimate values for the young. That night in 1963, the Fox Theater won the opening skirmish. In taking me to church, my parents were affirming everything that was American. Church was, in a sense, the only show in town. Everybody else was doing it. This is the height of church attendance in American history. Church, home, and state formed a vast consortium working together to instill Christian values. People grew up Christian simply by growing up American. That evening, the night at the Fox Theater opened on Sunday. While my parents or their forebearers assumed the culture would help prop up the church, almost nobody believes that today. Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, Catholics, everyone knows that something has changed. Jerry Falwell may still believe that electing a few senators, passing new laws, and restoring Father Knows Best to television will allow us to relax again and let the culture do our work for us. But most of us know better. It is not our world, if it ever was. My former neighbor across the parking lot, the rabbi, helped me understand the dynamic. One day over coffee, he remarked, "It's tough to be a Jew in Greenville." I granted him that. If I were Jewish, I wouldn't sleep well either, with Bob Jones running around loose. He continued, "We are forever telling our young, that's fine for everyone else, but it's not fine for you. You are special. You are different. You are a Jew. We have different values, a different story." I suddenly realized that I had heard very much that same concern expressed in young couples class at Northside Church in Bible Belt, Greenville. Such language is fine for everyone else, but not for you. Couples would tell their children, "You are special. You are Christian. We want other things out of life than the Joneses want. We have different opinions. We are Christian." Once again, it seems that church must learn the peculiarity of being Christian from the synagogue, which has long appreciated the peculiarity of being Jewish. Now, this was written in 1986. My neighbor, the rabbi, served a faith community that never had any illusions about its stance in the world. If its children were to grow up Jews, they would do so as strangers in a strange land. They would not be born Jews. The synagogue would have to make them that way. I believe that that day is coming, has already come, when the church must again take seriously the task of making Christians, of intentionally forming a peculiar people. And why not? After all, we were in the same educational business, the business of bringing forth self-contained, individual, self-discovered identities. Like American society as a whole, the church assumed that its task was to help individuals become even more assertive and expressive of their wants, desires, and rights. The church's predominant view of humanity seemed to be that people were bundles of desires waiting to be expressed. But everyone else had the same view. So who needs the church to tell me that my identity is in me, and that my life significance lies hidden in the recesses of my ego, and that life is a long process of learning more and more about me? Increasingly, numbers of people have come to see that such views are not only shallow and unworkable, but also unchristian. Apparently, we haven't seen that much since 1986. The gospel is a story about something that has happened to us, something that has come to us extra nos, from the outside. He's speaking Latin. This story is, in the words of the Reformers, an externum verbum, an external word. It claims that by rooting around in our own egos or by reflecting upon our life experiences as men and women, whites and blacks, we won't really discover much that is worth knowing unless we know this Jew from Nazareth who is the way, the truth, and the life, and are part of a people who follow him. It is only by listening to this story and allowing it to have its way with us that we learn anything worth knowing. As Augustine said, when we look at our lives without Christ, we look like a chicken yard full of tracks in the mud going this way and that. But in the light of his life, our lives take on meaning, pattern, and direction. Again, this is an article from 1968. I'll leave it there. You can read the rest. I'll put the link below. So, yeah, we're having this fight. What should we do? Well, we should teach people that in many ways Christians are made, not born. And yeah, as the church, we've got a lot to figure out. How are we going to figure it out? We're going to do the work. We're going to talk. We're going to think. We're going to pray. We're going to try. We're going to disagree. We're going to talk about our disagreements. And hopefully, we'll learn something along the way.